So, welcome all, honorable speakers, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I, Mr. Rudranarayan Das, on behalf of the organizers, extend my heartfelt welcome to all to this Ranjit Guru series of international webinar. This webinar is initiated by the Department of History and Political Science, Jawaharlal Nehru Mahavidyalaya, Cuttack, Odisha, in a close collaboration with Center for Adivasi Research and Development Studies, Odisha. I feel happy to express that we have successfully concluded the 56th round of panel discussion today. So in today's session, to enlighten us, we have with us the eminent speakers who are none other than Prof. Usha, Raman and Prof. Sucheta Mahajan. It's a pride privilege to host you, ma'am. The broad theme of our international conclave is kept as Initiative Policy Dialogue 2020 COVID-19 Life Practice Beyond Pandemic. So let us carry on the session. I would like to invite Professor Sarat Pradhan, the convener of the webinar, to initiate his brief welcome address. Over to you, Professor Pradhan.
Thank you, Rudranarayan. Good afternoon, everyone. Honorable guests, learned participants, I welcome all of you to this academic exposition. Friends, perhaps in world history, no single institution has acquired such a fantastic power in a short span of time except the press or social media or network. That is why, for seeing the growing importance of media, Digital called it the fourth state. Since freedom is to media, what oxygen is to human life. Image of social media thrives on the enable of freedom. To talk of a democracy without freedom of press or media is a contradiction in terms. In present days, the role and responsibility and integrity of media is very crucial both in national and international arena. Today's topic: practice, performance, participation, social media, and network movements have immense relevance. Let's have a valuable academic exercise through this seminar. I extend a warm welcome to Professor Usha Raman, Department of Communication, University of Hyderabad, a professional turned academician. Friends, there is a saying: take action, and each of moments will bring you closer to your goal than a mile of intention. In course of discussion on new social movements in contemporary India, preach in leading to high voltage conclusions very often. Such small assemblies also contribute to the vox populi of the state and nation. Such discussions are instrumental in uniting and reforming public from one sector to another sector of the society. In anticipate a beautiful analysis from learned resource persons like Professor Sucheta Mahajan, Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, on this webinar. Finally, I extend my heartfelt regards to noted speakers. Thank you everybody, and now let's listen to their valuable deliberation. Thank you all.
Thank you, Professor Pradhan, for your wonderful welcome address. Now, I would like to request Ms. Payal Agarwal for carry on the session with the introductions of our guests.
Um, First of all, warm greetings to one and all, and thanks a lot, Rudra sir, for giving me the pleasure to introduce our honorable guest for today's session. Actually, after the fascinating first session, we have very quickly headed towards the second session of today's lecture with very two eminent and distinguished guest speakers. Our first one is Professor Usha Raman. She is a professor of Department of Communications, University of Hyderabad. Her teaching interests include news reporting and feature writing, specialized writing in science, technology, environment and health, feminist media studies, science, health, communication, and social impact of digital media. Her research has been in the field of cultural studies of science, science and health communication, clinician-patient communication, children's media, popular, feminism and digital culture studies. As a 2016 Fulbright Fellow, she spent a semester as a faculty researcher at the MIT Media Lab in Cambridge, US. She is also an honorary fellow of the George Institute for Global Health and a member of Ethics Committee of LV Prasad Eye Institute and the Indian Institute of Public Health, Hyderabad. She is also the editor of Teacher Plus. Now, Teacher Plus is a monthly magazine for school teachers in India, and she also writes a fortnightly column on learning skills for the Hindus Education Plus titled Backpacker's Guide, as well as a fortnightly review column on podcast for the Hindus Sunday magazine Peace in a Pod. Ma'am, we welcome you from the core of our heart and thanks for connecting with us. Ma'am will put her insights on practice, performance, participation, social media and network movements. Our next speaker is Professor Sucheta Mahajan, Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, India. She has earned 24 years of teaching experience and 3 years as a research assistant and associate for an oral history project prior to teaching. Her areas of specialization include modern Indian history, contemporary Indian history, with the focus on the themes of colonialism, nationalism and communalism, decolonization in a comparative framework, and history and social theory. She was also a fellow of Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla. To her academic credit, she has around 4 numbers of international collaboration with her department and a number of research articles published in journals of national and international repute. Ma'am, thanks a lot for connecting with us and accepting our request. We welcome both of you from the core of our heart. Ma'am, your topic as suggested by you is a new social movement in contemporary India. It's also my humble request to the noted speakers to conclude their talks within 40 minutes so that we can have a healthy discussion, open forum discussion also. Now, after this brief introduction, I would like to stop here and invite Sucheta ma'am to please initiate her talk. Over to Sucheta ma'am.
Ma'am, please unmute yourself.
I will be requesting Sucheta ma'am to please unmute her mic so that we can listen to her.
So that's what. Am I clear now?
Yes, ma'am, you are very clear now.
Okay. So thank you so much, all of you, for giving me this opportunity to share some of my thoughts, assessments, characterization on a subject which I have not written about, but on a subject with which I have been grappling intellectually for the last many years, primarily because um, I have been a social activist in many of what I'm calling these new social movements, but I haven't quite had the opportunity to sit back and reflect on what are they about? Are they different from the social movements which we grew up on? What is their potential? What are their limitations? Is it really something new, or as usual, are we sort of putting labels, new labels on old bottles? So many of these questions um, in my own life in the last decade or so, being involved in struggles which are to do with the whole domain of what I can only call rights-based movements. That some of these questions, as I said, were there, and now I have this opportunity to share these ideas with you. So, not taking any more of your time, let me begin. Um, Today I'm a little over 60. In my youth, the movements that I saw around me were mostly class-based movements. The movements which I read about and I researched into were around the issue of national liberation. You might recall that the early 70s, which is the period that I'm talking about, by then decolonization, or rather the movements for national liberation in most of the colonies in the world, had reached their pinnacle, they had reached their climax, and new nation states had come up, particularly in Asia, Africa, and parts of Latin America. However, what we were studying and the theory that I should say, sympathetic to, that is Marxism and the whole interpretation of class, a class interpretation of history and politics, that started to get questioned in my mind as different sorts of movements enveloped us. Some of you might remember that Europe, particularly with the students' movement in Europe, known, more famously as the 1968 students' movement centered in Paris, these swept with them a whole generation of students. Of course, there were workers' parties, there were working class organizations who were part of this, and that's what gave them some of their strength and their potency. But there was something different. They were primarily student based movements, and more important, a lot of the discontent that was taking shape at this time among in the minds of students was over the issue of war. I remember the anti-war movement being joined by millions of students across the globe, not only in the USA, where of course the war in Vietnam had taken a very um, conflictual turn, and the casualties were huge, even on the sides of the imperialist powers like the United States of America. And this was an environment in which everything seemed to be questioned. And everything seemed to be questioned in a way which was quite different from the way that working class movements or peasant movements were earlier putting forward their class-based demands. You might recall Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement in the USA, and later on the turn that it took in the direction of what we can only call an identity-based movement, when what was called the movement for Black Power took over this movement. Many of us were not very happy by this kind of movements which were around issues of identity, but then they were there. The women's movement, in the form that many of us got involved in it, particularly in the 1980s, and at the same time, in the early 1980s, the ecological movements, the green movement, the environmental movement, whatever word you give to it. The point was that society was in a state of discontent. And the, the primary agents, the participants, those who were involved in these new movements, they were not, they did not share a belonging with either the nation or with, say, the working class or with the peasantry. That is, none of the old digits which we got from historical materialism, which we got from Marxism, seem to work anymore. Women's movements, environmental movements, they were around, as I said, broad issues which brought into their fold groups from across society. Another big difference that we noticed was that the political parties, which, for example, I had been associated with in terms of my research into the Congress Party and the independence struggle, when I wrote my book Independence and Partition, and was researching in the 80s and 90s, primarily in the 80s. Now, the new social movements were not limited to any one party. Yes, we cannot say, as is said today very often, that these new social movements of the 70s and 80s, that they were not about politics. No, I don't agree. Very often I see this definition that the new social movements were about culture, they were about society, they were about economy, they were about recognition, identity, they were not about politics. The understanding that I have of politics came to me from the women's movement, where we saw, of course, famously the statement, the personal is the political, but the broad point was that everything was political. What was called social or economic was also political. Yes, all that one can say was that it was not politics as it operated in the old ways. Another big change took place from about the 1990s. And this was the way that globalization took over the world. Globalization, which was simply a phenomenon in the private sector, in companies, where we talked about MNCs. Now globalization hit the economy as a whole. We talk now about globalization of capital, globalization of labor, and we found that the space of the nation state was being adjusted. I agree with Hobsbawm when he says that the nation state doesn't disappear with the coming of globalization, but yes, the nation state and its organizations adapt. The laws that we now started to talk about were no longer the laws only passed by a sovereign nation state, which we were familiar with earlier, but now they were international, legal obligations, whether to do with the ILO or to do with the World Trade Organization or by UN bodies. The point was that there were issues which were global phenomena and they affected most of the world. So, as I said, the world did not all unite and form like one country. No, not at all. In fact, national movements and around identity continue to thrive. But, and it's a big but, the movements that came up, continued to come up, had a transnational or you can say international aspect which could not be denied. In fact, that's what gave them some of their distinguishing characteristics as if we compare them with the earlier class-based and nation-based movements, which some theorists, political theorists, social theorists have started to call in the last couple of decades the word, they've started to use the word all social movements for them. So, as you can imagine, within about 20, 30 years, or even just 20 years of these social movements of a different kind coming up from the late 60s onwards, along with it came a social theory. Along with it came a political theory which sought to understand these movements. One of the first things which was noticed was that the economy in which these movements came up, the new social movements, were what can be called a post-industrial economy. And another second feature which one noticed was that these movements were no longer around economic issues, like workers' wages or 8-hour working day, etc., in the way that we had earlier, but the issues which got taken up were a lot around rights. That is why you will find that in India in particular, the word rights-based movements or movements around entitlements, this phrase often comes up. So the new movements were more about the words, the terms used for them were not the usual word or words liberation movement or class struggles, but now the word collective action, social changes, movements around social change, less deterministically Marxist sort of words and terms of description and definition which came to be used. Of course, let me emphasize that some of the most important breakthroughs as far as the theory of these new social movements were made by what one can call reformist or revisionist Marxists, Ernesto Laclau being a very famous one, and of course Immanuel Wallerstein, starting off as a Marxist, but as you know, later becoming more famous for what we call world systems theory. And yet one of the names which we associate a lot with these new social movements is, yes, you're right, that of Jürgen Habermas. And Habermas, in his definition of these movements, went a step further where he started to talk about a new kind of politics. So it's not only new social movements, but new social movements are talking about a new kind of politics, which is again a lot about rights, in contrast to the earlier politics, which is more about economic, political issues. And so the social aspect of these movements is what gets hugely underlined in the theoretical literature on on these social movements. You find words like civil society entering our lexicon. You find a term bypassing the state, that these movements tended to bypass the state. This was a word which often got used. And when we were describing the social groups which were involved in these movements, then rather than describe it in class terms, rather than saying workers, peasants, bourgeoisie, rather than that, less Marxist words, terms like margins, people at the margins, such words started to be used. Even if I just mention one or two or three of these movements, then you will be able to easily recognize what we are talking about. I've already mentioned the women's movement and the ecology movement and the anti-war movement, but more recently what we saw in the US, Black Lives Matter. About recognition, right? Now, this is very clearly that the whole movement around LGBT, for example, very clearly in that domain, movements which, that is, these are movements across classes, these are movements across nations, and that is also in a very fundamental way which describes what is distinguishing about these movements. However, and I come to India now, somebody just remind me when I have 15 minutes left. Payal?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Sure, ma'am. I will remind you.
Thank you so much. So coming to India, we began with India, but now I want to come back to India and look at it. In India, this distinction between the old and the new types of movements has been questioned by many activists and by many scholars. That is, the question has been raised, and Netri Chaudhary, who is my colleague here in the sociology department at JNU, in a very interesting article on the new social movements, also is one of those who raises this issue. And so does Gail Omrit in her book Reinventing Revolution. But I'm going to focus a little more on this question of can we really separate the two? And what I would say is that in India, as is the case when we look at so many other aspects of our society, the fact that we are compressing so many different historical stages into one stage, right? Centuries, feudalism, capitalism, all getting compressed into maybe 50 years. Because of this in particular, you find that there is an overlap. There's a huge overlap between the class-based movements and what one might call the new social movements. So Dalit movements, for example, take up issues not only of untouchability, recognition, discrimination, as one would imagine would be the most important social issues right now, but, and it's a very important but, the Dalits continue to be economically exploited. Hence, the class aspect, the class action in these movements also continues. It's not as if in the West, where class ends, nation ends, and then the new social, the margins and the other stuff, collective action takes over. No. In India, we find an overlap between these because class movements here are combining class politics or combining struggle along class lines with the new aspirations, the new anxieties around recognition around social discrimination, as I said, in the case of Dalits. The women's movement also, maybe Usha might talk about it, but this again we find that um, a lot of strength in this movement comes from poor women. Very often poor cultivating class women who give it its edge and its strength. However, on the other hand, as we know, there is also feminism, theoretical feminism, and issues to do with the movement, women's movement, more recently, as you know, around the whole issue of violence against women, dowry issues, they are huge. And so you find again that there is an overlap. Yes, there is a sense in which the women's movement is different from the women's movement of, let's say, the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And here I would say it is because this women's movement is stands on its own two legs. It's not dependent on political parties, though political parties, as you know, continue to have their women's wings. But yet the women's movement can stand on its own. And there is, in fact, among women who are part of these movements, there's a discontent with organized political parties which have just not delivered. So there are older issues of economic struggle, class struggle, which continue to give the women's movement its strength. And yet, as I said, there are newer issues to do with discrimination against women. There are newer issues of um, asserting the rights of women for sexual equality, asserting the right of women against traditional oppressive practices, for example, dowry, and assertion, for example, of women's equality, an understanding that women's property rights need to be fought for, and that whereas we may have done very well in the field of employment, but yet within the domain of marriage, within the domain of the family, within the domain of traditional society, a lot needs to be done. Even patriarchy continues to be something which needs to be struggled against in a very systematic and systematic way. Ecological movements or green movements are, I think, will give us a better example of the new social movements, where there's less overlapping, in the sense that um, these movements are very different from the movements of the 50s and 60s, when, as you know, there was a whole vision of economic development, and which was pushed, which was about modernization and economic development. You know, the dams being the temples of modern India, which the slogan which Nehru gave us. Whereas from the 80s and particularly 90s, of course, depends on which part of the country we are talking about, uh, the green movement, the movements which have become very, very important. For example, in the Himalayas, in North India, there was the Chipko movement. I'm mentioning it because it's very well known and there's a lot of literature which is there about it. But as you know, there is equally the very important movement against the Narmada dam, which brought in tribals, it brought in people at the margins of this development story, people who were facing a lot of exploitation in the case of the forest-based movements, exploitation by government contractors, exploitation by the entire, at the hands of what one can call the entire development model. And the Narmada Bachao Andolan was also very much about that. Uh, Maybe you could just stop for a minute and even think of the new type of leaders. Medha Patkar, very upright individual. Similarly, in the Himalayan region, for example, the leaders of the Chipko movement, you know, they were all Sundarlal Bahuguna, very leaders who commanded respect. They were Gandhian in a certain kind of way. They were beyond parties. Parties may support them, but they were beyond parties. They were not hesitant to expose corruption, and I think that is a very important um, feature of the new movements, that the new movements, because they operate outside the domain of the usual political space, that is the space where governments work. So they are not they don't fight elections, etc. Therefore, these leaders, whether they are in their, yes,
Sorry, ma'am, to interrupt.
no, yes,
15 minutes more as you instructed me to
okay.
remind you.
Thank you so much, Payana. So, what's different about these leaders, about the new type of social activists, is, as I said, that they are not corrupted by political power. Many of them, as I said, live very simple, what might call almost Gandhian lives. Sundarlal Bahuguna was famously one of them. They even applied Gandhian techniques of protest. So this was interesting that when Medha Patkar, again, as you know, so many of them sat on long fasts to, the whole idea being to shock, um, basically arouse the conscience of people who were behind that exploitation, and also to arouse the common people. Now, so being outside the main political frame is very clearly something which is a feature of this kind of new social movement. And as I said, the independence from political parties. Um, the, as I again repeating, that this does not mean that that a party will not have a women's wing associated with it. No, that can be there. The point is that they are not restricted by the political concerns of that party. They can take up issues which are beyond that. The whole Anna Hazare movement, for example, with all its limitations, over time we have become very aware of that, of the limitations of that. In fact, it has, I don't know the extent to which this is factual or not, but the presence of RSS activists among that movement has discredited it a bit. But as I said, this is something that one has only learned later. The point that I'm making here is that at that moment in time, these are movements which are able to capture the popular imagination in a way that more regular movements can't, because they very often take up one major issue, like violence against women, right? So there is then what happens then? Um, there is an entire wave of support from across the country, from different sections of society, including from men, as it should be the case. So the strength of these movements is this. The limitations of this movement, of course, as you can see, that if they are movements which often are spontaneous and they are not organized by a party or don't have a very rigid political organization, then that sometimes that also becomes, as you can imagine, somewhat restrictive. And then these movements tend to come up and do very well, but they also tend to disappear. They don't, you won't find longevity here. Then another movement may come up somewhere else, taking up partly that issue and partly other issues. But that the moment for that movement is over. So spontaneity, yes. Ability to reach across the board, different social groups, very good. But as I said, sometimes then it's like a wave. It comes up, but then it also, like the tide, it also recedes. Last but not least, I'd like to spend a few minutes to talk about the movements which I began with, which are what I'm calling the rights-based movements. That is, in India, and I'm talking here only about India, but I'm sure we find this elsewhere, particularly since the early 2000s. If I remember right, some of the highlighting of this type of movement came from the work of Amartya Sen, the whole idea of development with social justice. And the understanding that movements don't only have to be about overthrowing the state, like the national movements, etc., or they don't even have to be about reversing the policies, the wrong policies of the government, like I mentioned, the movements, the Chipko and the Narmada Bachao Andolan, which were basically questioning a certain model of development which had been imposed from the top. Now, these movements, four of them which were very important and they came up at different times. The right to information, movement around right to food, the movement around right to education, and the movement around right to employment. These movements, as I said, they were there in some embryonic form earlier also. The sensibility was there for them. But it is only in the decade of the 2000s, and then of course later, that this kind of a movement, which was about citizens coming to the fore to create spaces within the institutions of the state. It's very different. Citizens are creating spaces within state institutions in order to access better the provisions which are being made by the state for them. What does this mean? Why should a citizen need to have a movement, let's say, or be part of a movement to access what the state has provided for them? The state has provided it, you go across, there's a school, you go get your child enrolled, over. But as you all know, it doesn't happen that way. So there are laws on the statute book which come, but in order to get those laws implemented, NGOs come into the picture, groups of citizens come into the picture, and what one can call movements of citizens come up which arise from a sense of entitlement and right, that it is my right as a citizen to have education. It's my right as a citizen to have information. It's my right as a citizen of India to be provided with food security. So these rights-based movements came at a particular point of time, as I said, and they emerged from a very different understanding of the state, as I just spelled out. The state was not to be overthrown, it was not to be eroded. The state was there. If the state had to be accessed, the institutions of the state, they were seen as institutions which were owned by the citizen, but a corrupt bureaucracy or an unthinking bureaucracy did not allow this to happen. So you were within your right as a citizen to claim your rights. The Right to Information Act was one which I was most um, fascinated by, and we also in JNU, many of us were associated with it, and not only in terms of the framing of this and bringing in issues to do with access to information in the sense of knowledge and the archives, for example, as a historian, that I have the right to access information. You know that our government doesn't accept any of the universal protocols on these matters. I can go to London and see um, um, archives going where the rule is 30 years. After 30 years, anybody can see anything, however secret and classified. In India, it depends on the government. So this Right to Information Act, interestingly, though it emerged, as you know, out of the Indian Constitution, where the freedom of speech was very much there, freedom of information was something very much recognized, but it was only an implied right. It was not spelled out. By the new Right to Information Act, the Parliament of India makes an amendment and it sets out the rules and procedures by which a citizen can get the right to information. And it's very important. You know, sometimes we misunderstand this right. I see a lot of people critical saying, oh, so much waste of time, because as administrators, sometimes we have to answer ridiculous questions, right? But it has been used by social activists and ordinary citizens amazingly to expose corruption, make governance more transparent, to make it accountable. But here, as I said, of course, the social movement which was behind this act, the MKSS, particularly in Rajasthan, they had this very important movement there. But now what we require is, once the act is there, we need a continuing social movement or awareness in order to be able to work this. The National Food Security Act 2013, also known popularly as the Right to Food Act, again is a parliamentary act. It provides subsidized food to two-thirds of India's 1.2 billion people. What is important here? Why am I calling it a rights-based movement? Because, again, it did not come from above. From 2001 onwards, different organizations filed cases, some in the Supreme Court, some in other courts, some before the government, making petitions, demanding that the state must provide food security, that it was a responsibility of the government to provide food, particularly to poor and hungry people. It did not happen overnight, and we must understand this aspect of our laws, that the laws are coming at the end of a long struggle. In the case of the Right to Food Act, 20 interim orders were issued on the petition filed by PUCL. Finally, in 2002, two commissioners were appointed. Now, most often commissioners do nothing. In this case, these commissioners were fantastic, and they came up with so much material, and then there was so much pressure that eventually the government passed this act. So, what I'm trying to say here, show here, is the relationship between social movements and legislation. That this is not from the top legislation. Similarly, NREGA, as you know, the Right to Employment Act, from 2005, again, the Constitution talked about right to work, but it was not implementable. The NREGA Act made this implementable. I don't have to go into the details. All of you here know about it, how, you know, in the 100 poorest districts, 100 days in a year, etc. That is how it began with, and the ideal is to move and cover other parts also. But as you know, because this is how politics operates, because it was introduced by one government, then the government which came after 2014 put it on the back burner, said they didn't have funds for it. But interestingly, and I would like to underline this because your series is about the pandemic, the present corona pandemic. This law, which came about in a very different context, has proved to be very, very useful when those migrants whom nobody cared about, when they have traveled home and gone back to their villages, then this is the Employment Guarantee Act, which has allowed for their employment at that point of time. And even the government, which was so critical of it, has implemented it because obviously it suited them. Last of all, I'll just take a minute more. I'd like to end up the with a movement that is the movement around, which culminated in the Right to Education Act 2009, and then in 10 it was properly implemented. And this movement in particular, I know this from my own example, my own life example, that many many social movements in different parts of the country were behind the passage of this act, behind the framing and the passage of this act. This act certainly did not drop from above, from the enlightened vision of some bureaucrat or some policymaker or some politician. No, not at all. This is particularly a movement for abolition of child labor, abolition of bonded labor. A movement began by MV Foundation and its main organizer, Professor Shanta Sinha, who Usha is here. Shanta was a professor of political science at University of Hyderabad and devoted a large part of her life later on through this foundation. And I wrote a small book I documented this movement, and I wrote a small book on it also, which was published by National Book Trust, which I called Education and Social Change. So I saw it happening before me at the ground level, and how the one way of getting children out of bondage was to send them to school. This realization which came from the parents, from the teachers, and how poverty, the usual arguments, poor people won't send children to school, how all these arguments they were just debunked by the work done by Shanta and her organization. We also know about Kailash Satyarthi won the Nobel for his work with bonded children. and freeing them. So the act, when it came, linked the two. It said that children between the ages from 6 to 14 would be provided compulsory free education as a fundamental right. And there was an amendment of the Constitution, the 86th Amendment. And so now I would conclude by saying that we can say today that we are today at a point, if we are looking back at the last 50 years or so, where we have moved from class and national movements, largely economic based movements around class struggle, which are around opposition, largely around opposition to the state. We have moved to social movements which spawned, social movements which took up issues of a kind which involved large sections of society, where we would talk here about the movements against corruption. We talk here about the movements um, that about the protest movement against development, etc., where large numbers of people. It wasn't around class alone, but around a development model and its critique that these issues came up. And in the last 20 years have seen what we can call social movements operating within a rights-based framework. And these now, there's a different relationship that is positive with the state. It is not a directly oppositional one. It has forced activists to rethink our old understanding of the relationship between the state and struggle and class, where these movements, the last four that I talked about, right to employment, right to education, right to food, and right to information, these movements have been very effective, but I think they still need some amount of assessment, some amount of theorizing, because so far I find that radical political and social activists tend to be more dismissive of these movements than I believe they should be, because I think these movements have uh, taken us further, and in terms of very important, visible goals which have been achieved, and in terms of actually implementing some of the promises which were laid out in our constitution. So, whether what is going to be the shape of the movements in future, it's difficult to say, but I can only foresee that with that, given the state going in a very authoritarian direction, as we find it today, where it can tolerate no dissent at all, and people who speak against it are clamped in jail, etc., as we have seen. In such a situation, then of course, there is bound to be protest. There are bound to be movements, protest movements, and as I said, those protest movements will also be there if the state does not allow civil society to function um, within the space that it had earlier rested. So, because of this challenge from the state, we can expect that the earlier type of protest movements will also continue to be effective along with the new social movements. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. If there is, of course, whenever you have your questions, I'll be happy to give any clarification, etc. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, ma'am, for your excellent deliberations on new social movements. And yes, ma'am, movements have always brought revolutionary changes in society, and with the social movement uh, brought in the forefront the rights and dignity of people. But the question always remained that is the government enough right to accept those? So on this very note, I would like to thank you again. And now I would like to invite Professor Usha Raman to initiate her talk. Over to Usha, ma'am. I will be requesting Usha ma'am to please initiate her talk, unmute her mic and please initiate her talk. I will be
Ma'am,
requesting Rudra sir to...
ma'am, Usha ma'am, you are not audible. Your mic is unmuted, but there is some, I thought some connectivity issue or something else. Please.
Yes, Rudra sir, she is signing out and again signing in. She is trying
Okay,
again.
okay.
Can you hear me now? Yes, ma'am, we can hear you. Okay, great. Yeah, so I was just saying, thank you so much for inviting me, and in a way, I'm glad I went second because it was really a pleasure to listen to Professor Mahajan, and I think what she has done is sort of give us the broad historical picture and laid quite an expansive context within which we can try and understand, how movements occur, what are the questions they have taken up, and what are the big changes that some of the movements that she highlighted have brought about. And in many ways, we often don't think of those four movements that she talked about as radical. But in fact, what they have done is enable a kind of radical revisioning of what the society, the polity should look like. So I actually have a presentation. So if you don't mind, I'll just take a minute to present. Now it says present my entire screen, but I don't want to present my entire screen. Let's see. Okay. Let me see. Yeah, can you all see my screen?
Yes, ma'am, we can see your screen.
Okay.
Your
Okay,
PPT also.
okay, great. Yeah. So, yes, I'm going to speak through a PPT, and in a way, while Professor Mahajan has given us kind of a big picture, what I'm going to do is actually look at the small picture, because my interest has been in how do individuals, how do citizens actually carve out a space for social action, for civic action. And my interest again is in social media. So, there's a lot of conversation about how social media has revolutionized the space for communication, how, now everybody has a voice, or at least those who have internet access have voice, and how they are able to use this voice for multiple civic, social, and political ends. So I will talk through a few examples that I have looked at. Nothing on the scale of the RTI or NREGA or Right to Education, but smaller civic movements. So I just wanted to kind of set the stage by saying that there's been a lot of dismissing of social media activism, right? That, oh, it's easy, it's slacktivism. All you have to do is sign a petition or like something, and you feel like you have participated in the political or social process. But I think, it's easy to dismiss, but I think we do need to take these actions and these spaces a little more seriously. And I think especially, in the pandemic era, we realized that the online space is more important than we thought. And it's bringing a kind of new lens to understand what can happen if you are not online. The huge disenfranchisement that takes place when you do not have access to the internet. So those who do have access to the internet, how do they use it? What are the responsible ways in which we can engage with the state, with each other, with our communities, and how are people actually doing this? So that's really what my interest is. So right at the beginning, I just wanted to kind of, say I acknowledge that there is a dismissal of slacktivism, but I think it's important not to dismiss it and to go beyond these notions. So to ask some basic questions, what is the nature of the social in our times, right? So, and especially now during pandemic times, we realize that what we think of as socializing has radically changed, right? So the fact that, all of you and I are sitting at two sides of a screen, yet there is a sense of connectivity, means that we are thinking about socialization or socializing in different ways. So the nature of the social has undergone a change, whether we like it or not. And even if it is for a small slice of people, there is a change. So also in terms of the network, right? What is the nature of networks? It is no longer people that we just see or that we live close to, or even that we are connected with through our professions. It's much larger than that. So if I, for instance, have 2,000 people on my Facebook friends list, it's a network that some of whom I had never seen. Yes, there is a connection because of shared interests or one shared interest, or because somebody knows somebody that I know. So the nature of networks has also changed. There's also been a lot of intersection between what we think of as our society, our community, and how we think of our network. So I think some of these questions then give rise to the fourth question that I have up here, which is what kinds of political, civic, and economic formations do we see today as a result of these new forms of sociality, as a result of social media, as a result of the interaction of our sense of community with the internet. So these are some of the basic questions I think we need to keep in mind as we think about civic engagement or social activism in today's world. So I know that I'm using a lot of terms kind of, almost interchangeably, and I want to just put out there that I do recognize that there are distinctions, but there are multiple overlaps, right? So we talk about online politics, that is the kind of politicking that, let's say, parties engage in. They have access to huge databases, they all have their own social media presences, and so there is a playing of politics online. But there is also political engagement from the citizens, from ordinary people, in ways that had not happened before. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Then on the other hand, there are social movements. Of course, the kind of social movements that Professor Mahajan talked about, most of them happened or were initiated in a time before social media. So we know that social movements themselves do not need social media, but the presence of social media provides an additional arsenal, let's say, to those who want to raise questions about the state or mobilize communities in a particular manner. And then there is civic engagement. So I just like to make a distinction between social movements and civic engagement. So when we talk about social movements, we are generally talking about movements that seek to change social norms, that seek to
let's say, change the terms of engagement between the citizen and the state, change certain ways of life, so for instance, bonded labor or the need to have children in school and so on. Civic engagement, on the other hand, is more about getting the state to function in a manner that enables the citizen to live their daily life in the way that they should. So movements that have to do with, let's not cut down the trees, or we need better roads, or the certificates that are required for school, how do I get them, and how do we enable people to access them easily? So I think civic engagement tends to be about how people interact with the state and how we can enable those processes to happen in a more efficient, fair, and just manner. And then we have campaigns of different kinds. We have campaigns that are for short-term mobilization. So, I will talk a little bit about the RA, Save the RA Chorus, for instance, right, which was a civic campaign which had a definite goal in mind. They mobilized people for a short period of time, and they worked on social media, but they also worked offline. And so that's one kind of short-term mobilization. And then there is sustained engagement, right? So larger questions, let's say gender-based violence or child sexual abuse and so on, which require not just a change in laws, but very deep-seated social norms change. Those kinds of campaigns require long-term engagement. They don't go away, those problems don't go away in a day. So how do social media then help those movements or enable those movements? So those are some of the things that I will be talking about. So when we think about, who is this networked citizen and what is networked citizenship, does it actually lead to a new kind of civics? And this is a question that a lot of scholars, who study the internet, who study the intersection of the internet and social movements, try to look at. According to some scholars, there has been, and this is primarily because now we have these multiple kinds of information available to us through the internet, there is a move from what used to be called the informed citizen, that is someone who knows what their rights and responsibilities are as a citizen and what the state owes to them and what they owe to society, to what is called the monitorial citizen. And the monitorial citizen is somebody who, let's say, will see how the BJP has delivered on its electoral promises through the kind of data that ministries provide, and keep up with the information from the state to see if the state is keeping up with their promises and their duties. And then there is the engaged citizen, the one who actually intervenes in these processes. So there is a whole spectrum of modes of engagement of citizenship, and in the networked age, many scholars have recognized that there is greater possibility of engagement with the state as a citizen than was in previous years because of social media and because of internet-based communications. And I think, I don't know if any of you have read Malcolm Gladwell, who is a journalist, and he also writes a lot of popular history and social commentary. He actually coined the term, or he popularized the term slacktivism. He didn't coin it. And he actually says that you cannot, what happens on the internet is not real. And he very famously said that the revolution will not be tweeted. And while I agree that the revolution will not be based on a tweet, I think the revolution, by having the possibility of being tweeted, also opens the possibility of amplification and involving people who otherwise may not have been involved. So not to recognize that there is something called slacktivism. Of course, there are many of us who will sign a petition and forget about it. But then there are also many people who will sign the petition, try and get other people involved, actually find out what is happening, see what more they can do. So you have an entire spectrum of engagement. And this is what, this spectrum is what some scholars like Ethan Zuckerman have called thick and thin engagement. So what social media offers us is the possibility of thin engagement, also the possibility of thick engagement. So if you just want to feel like you are a citizen, you want to feel part of the conversation, you can click, you can like, you can favorite, you can retweet, and have that and experience that sense of involvement. But you can also do more than that. So along that spectrum, from thick to thin, there are multiple ways of being engaged. And Zuckerman also talks about the fact that social media has given us the possibility of engaging through voice, that is, through adding our voice to campaigns or to causes, and by getting involved in them. So he actually draws the axis between thin and thick engagement on the one hand, and voice and instrumentalism on the other. And he says that what social media has offered to us is an entirely new canvas of engagement. Now, in the pre-social media days, some of the movements, for instance, that Professor Mahajan talked about, the women's movement of the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, unless you actually were out there on the streets, in the meetings, there was no way of being involved. If you wanted to do something with the group, you had to go out there and put up posters, talk to people, get signatures in physical form. Whereas today, I can, organize a Twitter storm, right? With the hashtag #MeToo, and feel that I am a part of this conversation. So simply by adding voice, I'm able to take part in these movements. So what I've put down here is just some arguments for not dismissing social media and the internet, but recognizing that while they are not everything, they are a very significant something. And then the last point that I have here is that we have to recognize the strategic value of both core and periphery in online movements. So you might think of the core and periphery in any campaign. The core is the people who actually organize the movement, strategize around it, who lay out what are the demands going to be, how are they going to achieve those demands. And the periphery is people who amplify that, who say, okay, I'm going to take these demands and these campaign values and talk to communities in my area. So there is a value of core and there is a value of the periphery. Without the periphery, the core cannot function. So similarly, when you translate this into the online space, you find that, and I'll give you an example here, those who actually generate the campaign, of course, are key. They are absolutely important. But those who amplify it, either through posting it on their walls or retweeting or posting in WhatsApp groups and so on, they are the people, they are actually the army on the ground who are extending that campaign and making it more wider. So both the core and the periphery are important, and in social media campaigns you can actually see the periphery at work, right? The more the network effect, in fact, is the value of the periphery. So I'll just give you a few examples of campaigns that we have studied, that me and some of my students have studied. And what we found is that depending on the kind of campaign, you learn that there are different dynamics to these social media campaigns. And the term that I've used here, affordances, is, and I realize that I'm speaking to a Department of History and Historical Studies, and I come from media studies, so some of these terms may be very specific to media studies. So I'll just take a minute to explain that. So affordances is a term that is used to describe what a particular technology or a tool allows by its very nature. So network social movements, because of the way they are built and because of the nature of the internet, they allow the creation of communities of interest. So to give you an example, I'm part of a group that does tree walks in Hyderabad. Our interest is in looking at the flora of the city, documenting it, trying to make sure that old trees don't get cut, etc. So we have a WhatsApp group which has about 200 odd members, and it's really a community of interest. We're interested in trees and nature, and mostly we talk about that. But occasionally there will be a cause. Now, let's say, in the early days of the pandemic, when people were raising money for to help migrants and to feed families and so on, this group then mobilized that community of interest to actually contribute, to do things, to get volunteers and so on. So what was a very simple WhatsApp group was used to mobilize the conscience of that group to do other things. So and this is because a WhatsApp group, it's simple to communicate, it's one-to-many communications. You can very easily mobilize, you can copy a message, post it into other groups. So and this is the affordance of the WhatsApp group. So we're able to create a community of interest, we're able to mobilize that interest, and at times we're able to mobilize the conscience. And this group can then become an assembly of opinion as well. So the two examples that I've shown here are contrasting examples. One is Awaaz, which works primarily through petitions and mobilizing around mostly issues of the environment. And they create very focused campaigns that are, that have a single point agenda, that work around a particular cause, and then the campaign ends based on a certain number of signatures. And then the other example that I have here is Breakthrough, and some of you may have heard of Breakthrough TV. They work primarily on gender-based violence and domestic violence, and there clearly is not something that can work on a campaign mode. They need something that will sustain over time. So their campaign goes over time, and they do, of course, have messaging that is short term, but their goal or their fight is long term. It is to change social norms around gender. So it's interesting to see how they both work. Awaaz has less of an on-ground presence. They don't do many offline events. They're primarily about creating petitions, getting signatures, lobbying with people in power to either pass something or change something, whereas our Breakthrough is more about getting people to change the way they are. So one of their very famous campaigns or successful campaigns was the Bell Bajao campaign. Some of you may have seen it, which says if you hear something in your neighborhood, if you hear a woman being beaten, or if you hear some signs of domestic violence, just go ring the bell and break the chain. Ring the bell, ask for sugar, ask for milk, and just that simple act will break that chain. So, but essentially what they're trying to do is to get us to recognize that these things happen, change the conversation around it, and keep it in the public eye. So social media can be used in very different ways for different causes. But let's say I have a Facebook account and I come across a breakthrough message. I will then share it among my community of interest, get them to sign or get them to think about this issue, and over time create an assembly of opinion. So, and this happens because that group is captive, it's on my phone, it's in my computer, and I can mobilize that network for different purposes at any given time. So a slightly, more local issue, and I think, the really interesting thing about social media movements or social media based movements is that you can work at any scale. So this first picture that I have here is, it's about a dog that needs to be adopted, and so again, on Facebook you have dog lovers, right? So you share this with them, and you're able to create an action group that might be interested in adopting this dog or fostering him, and so on. So at a very micro level, you're able to create action-oriented messaging. The other example I have here was not such a successful campaign, but it's an example of how in Bangalore a community was able to set up a campaign to preserve a house that was a heritage home that was going to be destroyed. And in Hyderabad too, we've had campaigns like that. So these are not, campaigns on the scale of RTE or RTI, but they are examples of how civic action is mobilized through social media. And I think this is really an important space for us to preserve and to use in creative ways. Here's one more example. So we talked about communities of interest, communities of opinion, and then we moved to communities of practice. So again, this is a campaign many of you may be aware of. It started off, it was prompted by what was called the Ice Bucket Challenge, which was to raise awareness about ALS, the disease. But a very creative young journalist in Hyderabad picked it up and she turned it into the Rice Bucket Challenge. She sort of riffed off the Ice Bucket Challenge, posted it on Facebook and said, donate rice to help the needy. And this campaign is still going on. It started like 5 years ago, and the journalist who started it has been very successful in raising awareness about hunger and also doing something about it. And I think what is important, and I'll come to this later, about all of these kinds of campaigns is that it allows people not only to engage but also perform in a certain way, right? They're able to perform citizenship in a very obvious way. They're able to perform community mindedness in a very obvious way, because they not only donate, but then they share on social media that they've donated. So, I'm not saying that it's important to perform, but I think everybody has an innate need to be recognized for the good work they do. So, social media allows us to do that without without having to put posters all over the city. All you have to say is on your Facebook page that I participated in the Rice Bucket Challenge, and people know that here's a socially minded person. So we talked earlier about the range of kind of citizenship activities, right, that we can perform. One is, I am a conscious citizen is one. And I am an informed citizen who also knows something about what I'm talking about. So you post on Twitter not just to agree or disagree, but also to show that you know what you are following a certain conversation. So the idea is, not only do I know, but I want to show that I know, and I want to involve other people in my journey of being informed. So Twitter allows you to engage in conversations about politics, about citizenship, about social causes in a way that that shows that you are part of that conversation. And I think, one of the things about sociality is that not only do we want to participate, but we also want to be seen as participating. And I don't think that's a small thing. I think it is a very important thing that people have the need to feel like they are being seen. So this is an example of how many of us go after we vote, especially in the last election. After the Prime Minister tweeted his own marked finger, a whole lot of other people did the same. So Twitter was full of people doing what were called selfies, finger selfies. I participate, and I show that I do. So we've moved from simply performing citizenship to simply participating to also showing that we have participated, that is performing our citizenship. So this is the example that gives you a sense of what I meant by the core and periphery argument. And this may have been something that some of you saw. It was a large campaign that was run by Sadhguru, and his team. And initially, actually, many of us may have just seen Rally for Rivers and not really known who was behind it. And because it was about saving our rivers, it was about water conservation, many people signed up for it because the cause was attractive or resonated with them. But it was a very smartly run campaign, and it was an example of a campaign that worked both online and offline. So one, they had an online presence. They created this curiosity about Rally for Rivers. They said, in your city, we're going to be meeting at such and such date. If you're interested, come to the meeting. So the mobilization was done online and the consolidation was done offline. So the core could not, again, have done without the periphery. And the periphery did everything from sharing on Facebook to changing their profile picture with Rally for Rivers for 1 week, telling other people. They had this missed call thing where you could give a missed call just to register that you were interested in the call. So on social media, both the core and periphery are extremely important, and this was one campaign that showed that. So there was a very active and committed core driven by the personality of the Sadguru and an enthusiastic and outwardly raiding periphery. So even those who don't necessarily subscribe to the ideologies or the value systems of that particular of the Sadguru might still participate on the periphery because they believe in the cause. And again, I think, in a pre-social media era, this kind of a campaign may have been restricted only to followers and not so much to the general public, is what I think. Of course, it's very difficult to, make these statements because you can't compare, right, a campaign that is launched today with something that was launched 20 years ago before social media. It's only a surmise that we have to make. So yeah, just to kind of summarize some of the things I'm talking about. So what do we mean when we talk about social media civic practice or social media citizenship? So it's knowing, being informed, but also showing that we are informed. Performing the performance of being a caring civic actor. So it's like the tree that falls in the forest, right? If the tree falls and no one is there to see it, did the tree really fall? So I went and voted, but nobody saw me, so did I really vote? It's important for me to take a selfie and post it on social media. So to perform the knowledgeable civic actor, to perform the caring civic actor, to perform the participating and the engaged civic actor, the rice bucket challenge, for instance. So we register our presence in this large conversation of citizenship or being part of the nation by affirming our opinion, by showing preferences, by moving in certain directions. And it gives us a very important sense of being part of something bigger. And I think that kind of balances this notion of alienation that everyone feels in this, especially in contemporary times, right? Because the more networked we are, the more alienated we are from real social contact. And I think that that's one of the reasons we feel that it's so important to be seen on social media. So if you're not around on Facebook for 10 days and somebody notices it, there's a sense of affirmation that we all feel. So this is kind of a typology I'm still working with, and I think there is, and I'm not necessarily saying that this is a linear scale or anything, but I think there are different forms of performing online citizenship. So we perform being the concerned citizen. We perform being the critical or dissenting or resistant citizen. So, for instance, on some time ago there was this drive on Twitter that everybody would read the preamble to the Constitution and post it. So many of us did that because in some ways it was a mark of dissent, but it was also an affirmation that we believe in what this country is supposed to stand for. So, what is going to change by posting a video on Instagram or on Twitter? Maybe nothing changes, maybe something changes, but what mostly changes is your own sense of yourself and your performance of citizenship. And then there is the caring citizen, as in the Right Bucket Challenge. There's the informed citizen, that you retweet something that some expert has written. And then there is the active citizen, so as in the voting selfie. So then, what really does social media offer us as a civic space? It draws in a wide net of supporters by linking the personal with the political, the popular, and the civic, and I think that's really important. So some scholars, for instance, Dana Boyd talks about context collapse, which is that in one space, in the space of your phone or in the space of your computer screen, you have personal connection, you have social connection, you have professional connection, and on a single Facebook account, sometimes all of those things come together, and you have to be very careful with your privacy settings. If you don't want your colleagues to know something that is only about your family, you have to make sure that you changed your privacy settings in a way that it's visible only to family. So, there are those things. But then at the same time, you're able to mobilize your linkages across personal, popular, political and civic spaces, and your networks that occupy all of these spaces, just in that one window. The other, and I don't think the second point that I have here is necessarily a good thing, but it combines opinion with fact in extensive ways to further and support an argument. But this is also problematic because very often you'll find that people cannot distinguish between opinion and fact, and which often leads to, kind of fake news. But then the third point, building communities of interest and communities of practice, I think has a lot of potential because people who are communities of interest can have the potential to change minds of the others in that community. Social media allows us to keep alive the interest in an issue over a long period of time. So you can repost things, you can create a new conversation with old material. And as I said earlier, it offers both thin and thick modes of engagement. Really a continuum of what Shakuntala Banerjee and David Buckingham call a continuum of civic culture. And the last point is what I have already mentioned. It addresses the sense of helplessness that we often feel in today's complex environment, because it helps create what we might call a discursive presence through social media practice. We feel like we are part of the conversation. So just to point to some other movements that I think have extensively used social media, and I have not studied these extensively. I've done some work on Me Too and Usha, but it's at a very early stage because in that particular movement, my contention is that even those who remain silent gain a sense of solidarity because of that conversation. So you may not tweet, you may not comment, but by knowing that so many people are sharing their stories, you feel like you also your experience also could be validated. So I think feminist movements, there is an incorporation of the silent majority into some of these online movements, and that's something that I'm beginning to write about, but not at a point that I can really say anything intelligent. And these are some others, and I'm sure in each of your locations you have come across or participated in any number of movements. And I think Professor Mahajan mentioned that environmental movements possibly might have characteristics that we might classify as new social movements because they take on a variety of aspects of that combine identity, that combine utopianism, all kinds of politics into those movements, and those would be interesting to study. And so just I'm going to wrap up now in a couple of minutes. So just to round off the conversation by thinking about what the current pandemic and the lockdown and the pivot, what everybody is calling the pivot online, has shown us. It's shown us that connection is important, and the internet offers us meaningful ways to connect. And I think this is really important. We can be both civic and social actors on the internet. We can do and participate in conversations that are about politics, about civics, about community interests. And we can also have fun, engaging, leisure time conversations on the internet. We can be creative actors, and if any of you have looked at meme culture, there's, it's a wealth of information, and you see that young people are actually using social media in very creative ways to express a new kind of politics, and what is now called a participatory culture, right? And this actually cuts across class and socioeconomic barriers, because many young people, even in what we might think of as the margins, using a cheap mobile phone with internet connectivity, are participating in this conversation. And until the ban of TikTok, for instance, a lot of these conversations were not just about funny song videos. They were also making very important political statements, and I think we mustn't dismiss that. And I think for a lot of young people especially, the internet has helped them through this period. And again, not to discount the fact that we have a very real digital divide. For many of those who are on the internet, it's been a source of sustenance, it's been a source of connection. But we're also discovering the limits to digital engagement, and the threat of data capture and surveillance and all of those things, which are, of course, a completely different talk. So some questions that I thought I would just leave you with. Do we think of the digital sphere and social media as a catalyst or an amplifier? Can digital movements be sustained without on-ground action? And I would say probably not. I don't know of any digital movements that have not required on-ground action. There's an interesting work by Zeynep Tüfekçi, who's a Turkish scholar who looks at, who's worked extensively on social media movements in Turkey and in other places. And she says that you need that feet on the ground follow-up, either as follow-up or as lead-up to social media. So you can't have just one without the other. It's also important to kind of ask questions about who drives social media activism, especially since social media is now all owned by a few big companies. What's the interface between the corporate and the commercial and the political? And what is the nature of this digital public? Is it the public sphere that Habermas, and those who've expanded on Habermas's ideas have envisioned? Or is it just a collection of sphericles, as Nancy Fraser and others have talked about? So I think it's an interesting space to watch and study and think about, and certainly not dismiss. So I will stop there, and let me see, how do I stop presenting?
Thanks a lot, ma'am, for your beautiful explanation with lots of examples. Yes, as you said, social media has given everyone a platform to protest in a very creative ways, thereby developing a culture of participation. And we have a number of questions in the chat box. So I would like to invite Mr. Shubham Das to please initiate the question and answer session. Ma'am, he will be reading questions for you. Over to Mr. Shubham.
Thank you, ma'am. Now, first of all, I would like to invite Professor Sucheta Mahajan to receive few questions from the side of our participants, ma'am. Please unmute yourself, ma'am. Sucheta, ma'am, please unmute yourself.
Right.
Okay. Yes, ma'am. So before taking some questions, what I want to say here that madam, nowadays that we have all seen that the undue interference of the government in the freedom of speech and expression of citizens in the name of reasonable restriction, because we are still continuing the draconian as well as the colonial sedition law that is in section 124 IPC, which somehow restricts the democratic social movement. What I think, and I want to know your views on it. Then I will go to some questions. Then I will allow you to put your observation on it. Um, SK Imran asked, could you explain any empirical research about social movement in the dimension of education during the last 10 years? Vikram Jana had a pertinent question. What is the difference between social movements and new social movements, especially in the Indian context? What is the difference in ideology constraints in JP movement and Anna Hazare movement? Over to you, ma'am.
Let me begin with the last question first because it's easier to remember, I mean, as we grow old, we don't, remember easily. So, you know, um, it's a good question. What is the difference between what ideologically, if one compares the two movements? You see, because apparently on the surface, on the face of it, JP movement and the Anna Hazare movement seem to have a lot of similarities because it is, uh, you know, a kind of Gandhian figure, uh, much respected, not linked with a political party, hence having credibility. I can even use the word populist to some extent, but it doesn't help much really. But still, um, against JP's movement was clearly against authoritarianism as very specifically evident at that time because of the actions of a particular leader at that point of time. I think the Anna Hazare movement was a different type of response, and I really thank Usha for her lecture today, which was really, really insightful for me. And I, she's made me feel, I'm not saying that was Professor Raman's intention, but it made me feel pretty good about what I see as my, um, digital activism. That, because otherwise you start wondering, I mean, are you just spending all your time just with these petitions? And then I loved your point about even when you don't do anything, just to know what is out there. I thought that was very perceptive. That was so well done. Um, well, the Anna Hazare movement got in all kinds of people. Whereas I distinctly remember about the JP movement that the sympathy was there from people, but maybe because of the emergency and the whole atmosphere of, political atmosphere where no politics was possible, um, you had to pay a lot. You had to make a lot of sacrifice. You had to go to jail, uh, you know, to be part of his movement. Many people at that time, young people, they also, there was an ideological dimension which was in the direction of socialism. I mean, JP has been a socialist from the 30s. He was one of the founders of the Congress Socialist Party, one of the big leaders. But not just that, he continued with through the 50s, 60s. His ideology. I mean, he subscribed to a socialist ideology, and many of the people today, as we know, Lalu Prasad Yadav for one, and many others, sort of cut their political teeth in this movement. And there was an ideology, call it Lohiite, call it socialist, George Fernandez, the whole lot. There was a socialist, broad, eclectic socialist ideas were very much there. So I think that was one big difference. The sacrifices that had to be made were very great. I think the Anna Hazare movement allowed you from the comfort of your home, like you could simply contribute financially, and at best you went to Lal, what was it, the Maidan, Ramlila Maidan in Delhi, which was the center. It allowed. But one worrying thing about both of them, which has come out in more recent years, but I cannot say much about it because I haven't done the research. But I have no reason to disbelieve, but still I can only state it, which is the RSS involvement. That, both in the JP movement, the RSS was very much there. And in the Anna Hazare movement, also those who have studied it more recently have pointed out to this as a somewhat, as a feature which perhaps many were not aware of, and if many were aware of, may not have been so comfortable with it, to put it, just mildly. So I think quite a lot of differences and some similarities, of course. In terms of stature, personally, I would say no comparison between JP and Anna Hazare. I mean, JP was a towering political figure of his time. He was only second to Nehru, I would say, and I'm a great admirer of Sardar Patel. So, I mean, don't misunderstand me when I say next to Patel, Nehru. I mean in the sense of his intellect and the sharpness of his political sort of wit, and it was very, and there's no doubt about it. It's just that at that particular point of time, socialists left the Congress and then went into the wilderness a bit, and then the Lohiite type of tradition became a bit stronger, and JP, there were many reasons for his not coming forward, but he was a very towering political figure. I think the Anna Hazare had great qualities, but I don't think we could put him in that category. Vikram, your first question about what's the difference between old social movements and new ones? I mean, I thought that was the topic for the whole lecture. So, do you really want me to summarize it again? I think not. When you get the recording of this, you can listen to it again. Huh? I'm not being dismissive, but honestly, I will answer if you insist. Huh? So, what else? There was a Shubham. What was the question in between?
Actually, my question was that the misuse of the sedition law. That's about.
Sorry.
The misuse of sedition law. That the way that the government is misused is a sedition law over if you take the account of the freedom of speech and expression of the citizen. Reasonable in the name of reasonable restriction, the government uses the draconian sedition law over citizens to restrict them.
See that. Thank you, Shubham, for that. That I think that is exactly it. Supports what I'm saying. That laws or legislation often come about as the end product of powerful protest movements or other movements which are demanding those laws or have taken up those issues, and then a point comes where the government passes a law, right, to solve that issue, to do something about it. But as you know, as you are saying, what happens then is that unless the movement continues to implement those laws, then otherwise the what is the status quo? The status quo is the what you're talking about, which is that the bureaucracy is always comfortable, the ruling class is always comfortable with a situation in which there is no change. And the more draconian a law, the better. It's not only that these are, I know it's shocking when we see that these are colonial era laws, but the fact of the matter is that until we have an aware public, and that's what we are calling social movements. I mean, I think Professor Raman sort of brilliantly brought out that how you don't have to be, you don't have to knock over a statue, you don't have to pull down a presidential palace, no, to have a revolution, but an aware public which makes its voice heard in whatever way. So till that happens, then this contradiction is bound to be there. That the laws will be there, we'll fight, and we'll get a law, and then after that, back to square one. Because then we think that we have won. But no, the real struggle actually begins. Uh, Today, the Right to Information Act, sorry, the Right to Education Act, I know from Professor Shanta Sinha that it is hollow. It is hollow in the sense that it has so many of the issues which were flagged. Just now, the bureaucracy has to implement it. No, the Directorate of Education has to release funds. No, the World Bank continues to be the agency which funds. So until we are there as watchdogs, seeing that okay, how are these laws implemented, then nothing's going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Now I would like to invite Professor Usha Raman to respond to a couple of questions from the side of our participants. Okay. Thank you, ma'am, that you have rightly pointed out the networked movement such as the Bell Bajao campaign, Me Too, and the Rice Bucket Challenge very nicely that you have explained. But we always know that the social media is vastly used as a tool of freedom of expression. But when the absolute truth is conveyed by someone, if we see, sometimes government use its various IT acts and other acts to restrict the voice of the people. If you take the example, very recent example, if you take the case of Prashant Bhushan into consideration, what he said, the truth, that everyone knows, there is no doubt. But still he was dragged to Supreme Court. Did not you think that Supreme Court had a greater role to play to protect the rights of the right to peaceful movement of citizens? Now a time which is very crucial. The Bikram Mahapatra had a most pertinent questions for you. That transnational network theory, how impacts online social movements driven by social media, and what is the political economy of social media? Yes, if we look Niyamgiri and POSCO movement from Odisha, the important online connectivity across the globe united to stop illegal mining and authoritarian misguidance towards marginalized. What is your opinion on it?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. I think they're both big questions, and they also make apparent the fact that social media is of this world, right? It's not divorced from the world. So if there are flaws in our judicial system or in the way laws are implemented, then those flaws will also appear in the way social media is governed. Although, on the other hand, social media is still, the regulation of social media is still a contested terrain, and I think governments everywhere are still trying to figure out how and whether it should be regulated. But in terms of, the Prashant Bhushan case, all I can say is something like that would never have become conversation among large parts of the middle classes if not for its circulation on social media. Now, today there was another term that I came across called just like you have amplification on social media of certain causes, you also have a phenomenon where the real issues of a country often are drowned out by the kind of conversation that exists on social media. So, okay, whether it is Prashant Bhushan's case, I think was a legitimate case of democracy to talk about, but look at Sushant Singh Rathor's case. It just hijacked media of all kinds everywhere in the country. So you have something like that just takes over the conversation, and I think in some ways, so it takes over the mainstream media conversation. So social media can still have spaces where we can stay away from that conversation and engage in other conversations. Now, I know this is kind of not directly answering your question, but I think when there are issues of that require more than a 9 p.m. Anna Goswami shouting debate, then there are spaces on social media that allow for that debate. Most of the time, what we think about social media is shouting on Twitter, but I think that's one part of it. There is another space there where people can actually engage in conversation about these issues. And then maybe there is a critical mass of opinion that can be generated that is then put into, let's say, op-eds in the newspaper and so on. So, judicial reform, legislative reform, these are all things that take years, if not decades, to change, and that's the kind of movement that was required with the RTE or right to information, which social media can only help by expanding the size of the informed public and offer them a space outside of the mainstream media where slightly more slow conversations can take place. In terms of the other question about political economy of social media, I mean, I think this is the question for our times, right? We already know, like, Facebook has been deeply implicated in directing, in some ways, the political conversation in the country. And just 2 days ago, Anki Das left her post at Facebook. And so there is, it's highly problematic that these spaces that we are using for civic discourse are actually owned by huge corporations that are making their money out of a certain kind of surveillance. That's a contradiction that I'm not sure how we will resolve. In some ways, there is a lot of digital activism happening in our country. I think India has quite a big voice in the Internet Governance Forum. There are a lot of people who are working at the interface of media and legal studies to try and figure out what are ways in which to intervene in these spaces and rescue conversations from the interests of big business. So privacy is one of the issues, data capture is another issue. But right now we don't have those answers. The only thing we can do is to continue to use them for the conversations we want to have, and hope that someone will answer the questions about the political economy. But to be conscious of that is one thing, and for all the vilification of Facebook, at least we are still able to talk on Facebook about the problems of Facebook, right? I mean, that still happens. So I can say on Facebook, I can post articles that are extremely critical about Facebook on Facebook. So far, that has not been stopped. And I think as long as we have that, we should use it. But with the knowledge that it is a corporate space, corporate-owned space. But then, going out, I think one of the questions was, how is it different from on-the-ground protest? It's completely, it can at best only be complementary. It can never replace on-the-ground protest, at least, in the vision of the world that I have in my head.
So there is one question from also Vikram ma'am.
Yeah.
Can social media adjust the public philosophy and political class or political society in respect to cultural society at large?
I'm not sure I get the question. Do you want to clarify it?
Can I repeat the question, ma'am?
No, I can read the question here, but I'm not sure I understand the question. How? Yeah, I'm not clear about the question. I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Over to Payal, ma'am.
Okay. We have started the session at 4 and now it's almost 6. So now as the time passed quickly with the excellent deliberations of both the speakers, we are heading towards its concluding part. So to conclude the session, I would like to invite Mr. Shubham Das again to conclude the session by giving vote of thanks. Over to Shubham, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. Good evening to all. I am honored and lucky to have the opportunity to give a formal vote of thanks for this session. First of all, I would like to thank our esteemed guests, Professor Sucheta Mahajan and Professor Usha Raman, for a brainstorming and insightful deliberation. I extend my hearty thanks to Dr. Vikram Kesari Jana, Director of CARD Odisha, and Chinmay Sahu, Executive Director of CARD, for their friendly cooperation to organize this webinar. I would also like to express my profound gratitude to our Principal, Professor Prof. Chakrabarty, for his cooperation in organizing this webinar. And I would also like to thank Convener Professor Sarat Chandra Pradhan, Coordinator Mr. Rudranarayan Das, and Co-Coordinator Ms. Payal Agarwal and Baidar Das for their support and guidance to organize this event. Finally, I would also like to thank to all the students, academicians, intellectuals, media persons, those who have spared their valuable time with us. Thank you, everyone. The meeting is concluded now.
Thank you.